Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program comes to you from the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPA is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore. It tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. And this program is part of that effort. Now, let me dive right into today's program and introduce my guest, Dr. Lorenzo Veracini. Dr. Veracini is Associate Professor in History and Politics at Swinburne's Institute for Social Research. His research focuses on the history of colonial systems and settler colonialism. Dr. Veracini has authored several publications, including Israel and Settler Society, which came out in 2006, Settler-Colonialism, a Theoretical Overview, which is a 2010 book, The Settler Colonial Present, which came out in 2015, and most recently, The World Turned Inside Out, Settler Colonialism as a Political Idea. He has also co-edited the Routledge Handbook of the History of Settler Colonialism, which was in 2016, and is a former editor-in-chief of Settler Colonial Studies. Now, if it's not obvious by now, Dr. Veracini is with me because the tragedy unfolding in Gaza and occupied Palestinian territories has revived like nothing else would have Israel's Zionist idea of settler colonialism. Reviewing Dr. Veracini's latest book, The World Turned Upside Down, Neve Gordon, an Israeli professor of international law and human rights at Queen Mary University, writes, and I'm quoting from what he wrote, about midway through The World Turned Upside Down, Lorenzo Veracini cites Victor Hugo. While the famous French author frequently wrote about the internal crisis facing France, he was always very careful not to endorse revolution. Rather than agitate for revolutionary change, he urged his readers to relocate and make old Africa fit for civilization. Go, peoples, take this land, Hugo exclaimed, adding, who owns it? No one. Take this land that is God's land, take it. Pour your surplus into Africa and at the same time solve your social problems. Transform your proletarians into property owners, unquote. So welcome to the program, Lorenzo. Let me begin with a passage from your book, which I want to use so we can get to your theoretical framework. And again, it's a quote from your book, The World Turned Inside Out. There are many displacements. While volitional and forced displacements are often difficult to disentangle from each other, the two may be considered as opposite ends of a spectrum of possibility. This book focuses on the volitional end of the spectrum, even if those who advocated voluntary displacement would typically have argued that it was an absolute necessity, that there was ultimately no choice. Thus, the book's focus does not deny other dislocations. There were many, or that non-voluntary displacements did not interact with voluntary ones. Either way, opting out demanded an elsewhere. The places had always been there and were not empty. Many indigenous sovereign polities populated these lands, but settler colonialism as a globally expanding mode of domination and new modes of transport provided control and access to many elsewhere. Now, my first question is that, and I mean, this is the sense that I get, and let me say that I haven't read all your books. So allow me for any misconception of your framework. But it seems to me that the focus is more on the people coming from outside and occupying a land rather than the ones who were already there, because unlike what Victor Hugo thought, that there's no one there, there are always people there. So let's begin with that. And you can explain your theoretical framework for our viewers.
Well, first of all, thank you for your wonderful introduction. The main point I wanted to make with my book is that we know the history of indigenous peoples, and this was one of the greatest achievements of a comprehensive process of history rewriting that came in different stages in different countries in the last third of the 20th century and today. So we we knew the histories of the old countries, and we knew the histories of the new countries, and we knew that the history of the new countries were also the histories of the indigenous peoples that populated them. So in this historiographical landscape, what I found was that we were missing a piece. We were missing the reasons and the aspirations of those who wanted to move. You have read my book. You know I'm not seeing the projects of displacements I talk about as political necessities. I am very critical, but I thought that I should write a book that I couldn't find, I couldn't read, and yes, the political tradition I discovered by reading the sources and the novels, the tracts, the poems, the diaries, the traveling notes, even the surveying notes. What I found is that there was a tradition we didn't know about. See, there is a strange process going in the historiographies of the old countries. There's people that at one point decide to move, so they are part of the story, and then they disappear, right? And in the historiographies of the new country, we see that at one point, the people that are coming from somewhere else, the settlers, make their move, they enter the place, they start doing what they do. And the story begins then. But we don't have a sense of what is the prehistory of the new country and what is the future history of the old country. We miss that because we cannot consider the two in the same frame. So I thought, following this political tradition, I thought appraising it, outlining it, and what I found was that it is a coherent tradition. The people think alike. The people that I'm talking about read each other. They look at each other. They look at each other's experiences in settling new lands. And in the end, there is a global history of this political tradition, the tradition of displacement. And if we add that piece to the story that we already know, the histories of the empire, the history of the metropole, and the history of the colonies, then we get a sense of what really is happening. Otherwise, we don't get who these people are and why they're doing what they're doing.
Right. I perfectly understand the theoretical framework and the missing piece that you were talking about. In terms of, we do it all the time in social sciences. This is a kind of parsimony, if you will, but it also restricts our domain. I do think that you, had a clear idea of, so at least in terms of, implication, that this was part of what came to be known because of Rudyard Kipling's poem, came to be known as the white man's burden at one level. Because again, quoting from your book, where you say the colonies became a veritable template in an international network of domestic colonial activity, an activity prompted by pan-European social and economic crisis following the end of the Napoleonic Wars. But displacement becomes a mild word when you juxtapose it with the experience of the people, of the indigenous people, as you put it, when the foreigners arrive in that land. And I make this point because I mentioned Neve Gordon's review of your book. And in that review, he also writes that settler-colonialism is also much more than displacement, since it is constituted through a particular encounter between the settler and the indigenous population. So without prejudice to your theoretical framework, I also want to find out from you, because you said that you've been critical of this, of how do you look at the experience of the indigenous populations in the face of the settlers coming from outside?
Look, I primarily read the work of indigenous people and listen to indigenous people telling their history. There are problems with settlers doing indigenous histories. But for example, I come from Australia, and we are lucky now to be able to read indigenous histories of indigenous people. And I defer to that scholarship. It's compelling, it's authoritative, it's by now a substantive body of scholarship. And there is no need for a settler to tell the history of indigenous people when it has already been said, and eloquently and convincingly. So the idea was never to disregard the history of indigenous people. The idea was to incorporate the achievements of a massive historiographical inscription of the indigenous experience. So my work comes after these rewriting of indigenous history, these writing of indigenous history into nationalist historiographies, and builds on it. I learn from my indigenous teachers, from indigenous elders, and so the point is that once the experience of indigenous people has been reincorporated into the body of historiographical work that we can access, then we can look at settlers with a different eye, right? And we can look at settlers doing what they do in the contexts where they operate, benefiting from the critique of this experience that has been offered by indigenous scholars and indigenous voices. Indigenous and settlers are a strange couple. We are talking about a relationship. The two positions are relational. So you are not indigenous until you meet a settler, and you're not a settler until you meet an indigenous person. It's a bit like you're not a husband unless you are married, and you're not a wife unless you're married, right? It's you are only who you are in relation to the other, and it's an abusive relationship. But
I was about to use this term that it's going to be a very abusive relationship. Yeah.
It's a terrible relationship. Yeah. It's a terrible relationship. And colonialism is a terrible relationship, but that's not the end of the story. You see, in colonialism, the relationship is abusive but ongoing. The colonizer wants to stay colonizer and wants the colonized to remain colonized forever. And so, if the colonizer gets what he wants, the relationship remains the same. It's reproduced through time, right? But in the case of settler colonialism, it's different because the settlers are not just like any other colonizers. They are particular colonizers. They want the land, but not the indigenous people.
Correct.
So that abusive relationship ends up in murder if the settler has his way, and in hiding the body afterwards because of guilt and shame and all other things that come after the fact, after conquering, the frontiers and so on and so forth. So I was privileged to write when the indigenous experience had already been recovered, and so
you could draw on that also.
Absolutely, but a book is not something that stands on itself. It's always an intervention in the context of a debate, and I felt that I could say things that were new about settlers. And so I wrote my book.
No, absolutely. I perfectly understand your framework, but it's also an interesting point from where to sort of segue into the broader issue. Now, there are two types of reactions of the indigenous peoples. One is where, like, Tasmania, New Zealand, Australia, and many other places where the indigenous populations were persecuted, exterminated, displaced, and somehow, in terms initially at least, absorbed as labor, also as second or third class parts of the dominant settler society. But there were other areas where obviously the indigenous people rose up and there was war. And for instance, a good example would be the Pied Noirs in Algeria, and the Algerian War of Independence. So now we are witnessing a similar kind of, and you've written a book on that. Unfortunately, that's not a book that I've read, so I don't know the contents of it, about the Israeli settler colonialism. We're watching what's happening in the occupied Palestinian territories and in Gaza. And we are also now, in many ways, in a modern world where hopefully the old ideas of colonizing indigenous peoples are dying or have died out. How do you look at this situation? I mean, in terms of your research, in terms of your study of the histories of indigenous peoples, and in terms of what's unfolding before us?
Settler colonialism as an idea, as a political tradition, is one thing. Obviously, each place, each location, each country, each region has a different history, and these are complex histories. And there were settlers, but there were other colonizers operating in the same colonies. And there were metropolitan colonists, there were missionaries, there were traders, there were planters who had an interest in maintaining an indigenous population for the purpose of exploitation. There were all sorts of different things happening in every country. So what we are talking here is a very complex history. Indeed, a complex of complex histories, each different.
Right. And I agreeing with you, just to add this point so that you can, I mean, I'm not talking about similarities of or applying the particularities of one particular area onto another, but I'm just looking at the idea in its generic form and the application of that idea in different parts of the world.
And what happened in Palestine when the Zionists first arrived was that a project of replacement took shape over the decades, and it's a history with many turns. It's not a linear history. When the settlers first came, they came to make money. And the best way to make money was to exploit a local peasantry and to organize production for international markets. But the settlers that came in a further wave of settlement had different ideas. They wanted what they were calling the conquest of labor. They wanted to replace the labor that indigenous people were providing. And then there were all sorts of things happening. But Zionism has been in the business of displacing Palestinians for a very long time now. And what happens in Gaza is terrifying. genocide happens every time a particular political project reaches its strategic impasse, reaches its strategic inability to think anything else. So it's not a winning state that performs genocide. It's a state that is losing it, that abandons itself to a genocidal impulse. It's the dying Ottoman Empire. It's Nazi Germany that has been defeated on the Eastern Front, right? And so I am worried that what we are talking now here is no longer settler colonialism, but rage. The rage the colonizers unleashes on a particular population because they cannot think of anything else.
In the name or on the pretext, if you will, of self-defense, without really going into the historical trajectory of why the Palestinians are doing what they're doing in terms of their resistance. But the interesting thing, and I won't get your take on this because I've had these discussions with lots of Jewish scholars, also Israeli scholars, in terms of the Zionist idea. Now, Theodor Herzl's Zionism, which was secular, perhaps also socialist, and he wasn't particularly interested in the religious aspect or the rabbinical sort of, orders and the rest of it. He's even written about that. However, he died much before this idea became 1904, I think, if I remember his date of death correctly, before this entire project actually started and got into the hands of people who were far more radical. And then because even secular Zionism made references to the Bible, to the Old Testament, there was a natural progression from there to religious Zionism and to settlements, especially after the 1967 war, in which Israel suddenly conquered a lot of territory. So my question really is that when you say that you're worried, this seems to be a mortal combat, because unless the idea of Eretz Yisrael, which is the land of Israel, and the whole sort of biblical notion of it, is laid to rest, to me it does not appear that there could be a possibility of either a two-state solution, which, frankly, if you ask me, is dead in the water, or an idea of a one state. It's not going to happen. But I certainly want to get your take on it.
I don't know the future. I have already said that I am incredibly worried. In a way, you also express a worry, the worry that there will be no solution. On the other hand, even the very notion of a solution is probably misleading, because there will be no solution. These two national collectives will coexist forever in different configurations of power and sovereignty and self-determination. And so I agree that right now it is impossible to think about alternatives other than mortal combat. But reality has a habit of surprising us, and I am of the opinion that in the end, Israel will realize that it is in its best interest to reconfigure relationship with the Palestinian National Collective in ways that are more conducive to Israeli interests, And I'm hopeful that despite the impulse, there will not be a genocide in Gaza. That it will be found that it is in Israel's best interest not to proceed, which is my hope. You should know that many have left Israel and went abroad.
Yeah.
And a majority of the Jewish diaspora globally is adamant on never, ever moving to Israel. Israel's credit rating has been downgraded for the first time in its history. Strategically, honestly, the military effort is not that convincing. They couldn't reoccupy the whole of the Gaza Strip. They couldn't liberate the hostages. They could only kill many, many people that had nothing to do with resistance. And they lost many soldiers. And strategically, they are now exactly where they were at the beginning of this conflict. And so, on the one hand, facing defeat, you have a genocidal impulse. On the other hand, facing a strategic impasse, you may reconsider what your options are, and that's my hope.
I agree with you that history and events on the ground can take turns that can surprise us. But I also agree with you that there are a number of Israeli intellectuals who believe very strongly and firmly that the current policy or strategy or whatever you might call it of the state of Israel is not something that is redounding to the advantage of Israel or the Jews that live in Israel. But we have also seen that, and this was before the October 7 assault by Hamas, it was widely accepted within Israel also that the current Israeli government is the most right-wing in the history of Israel. And you have settlers, illegal settlers, holding very important cabinet portfolios. Like Smotrich is one, Ben Gvir is another. Even the IDF chief, the current IDF chief, is the first in the history of Israel who is part of an illegal settlement. So it seems to me that the dissent or the more discerning part of the Israeli Jews are in a minority. And that is what worries me in terms of how this trend can change into the understanding that you're hoping for.
Look, the political culture of Israel has deteriorated dramatically from previous decades. But having nicer settlers doesn't mean that they are less settlers than the aggressive, violent settlers that we see today. They were doing settler colonialism. They were dispossessing Palestinians. The only difference is that now Israel is at a significant crisis. It's unable to militarily defeat a resistance that on paper should not be able to withstand its onslaught. It's unable to free the hostages. It's unable to convince the international public opinion. In fact, on this score, the performance of the public relation establishment in Israel is especially disappointing.
What they call the Hasbara.
Things are changing rapidly, and we should not forget that the settlers, the violent settlers, are a minority of the settlers, and the settlers are a minority of the Jewish collective in Israel-Palestine, and the Jewish collective in Israel-Palestine now it's a minority because it is likely that a majority of the people living under Israeli sovereignty right now are not Jewish. So, from a Zionist point of view, the situation is really compromised, and a recalculation of the options is what the thinking heads should perhaps want to perform.
No, I agree with you. I was talking to Dr. Barnett Rubin, who is Jewish, an American scholar and policy person. And he told me, he said, today Israel is the most unsafe place for the Jewish people. But thank you so much, Dr. Lorenzo Veracini, for speaking with us. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. That helps us bring you quality discussions. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.